There is a point where studying stops feeling slow, heavy, and exhausting, and starts feeling almost uncomfortable in a different way, not because it's hard, but because of how fast things begin to click, connect, and compress in your mind, to the point where it feels like you're skipping steps you were never supposed to skip. Most people never experience this because they are conditioned to believe that learning must be proportional to time spent, effort invested, and repetition endured, so when information suddenly locks in quickly, with clarity and control, the sensation feels suspicious, almost illegal, as if you're breaking an unspoken rule about how studying is supposed to work. But in environments where speed matters more than comfort, where knowledge must be absorbed, structured, and deployed immediately, this kind of learning is not only normal, it's expected, because the brain is capable of operating at far higher efficiency when the right cognitive conditions are imposed instead of left to chance. What makes this feel forbidden is not the method itself, but the fact that most people are trained to study in ways that actively prevent their brain from entering this compressed, high-speed mode, keeping learning slow, fragmented, and emotionally draining by default. This video is not about hacks, tricks, or motivation spikes, but about exposing the cognitive method that forces the brain to drop unnecessary processing, eliminate hesitation, and move at a speed that feels unnatural if you've never experienced it before. And if you've ever wondered how some people seem to learn in hours what takes others weeks, this is where that difference actually starts. Fast study feels illegal because it violates almost everything you were taught to associate with real learning: long hours, visible struggle, repetition, and mental fatigue as proof that something meaningful is happening. When those signals disappear and learning becomes sharp, contained, and surprisingly efficient, the brain flags it as suspicious, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. From early education onward, most systems reward endurance over efficiency. You are trained to sit longer, read more, and tolerate boredom as if time itself were the currency of knowledge. Over time, the brain internalizes this rule and starts equating slowness with depth, so when information is absorbed quickly, without emotional friction, it feels like cheating the process rather than mastering it. There is also a social layer to this discomfort. Fast learners often hide how efficiently they study because speed challenges the shared narrative that success must be earned through visible suffering. If learning becomes too clean, too controlled, it threatens the belief that struggle is mandatory, which makes speed feel taboo instead of optimal. On a neurological level, the problem is even clearer. Most people study in states of low-grade stress, constant context switching, and open-ended effort. Their brains never experience what it feels like to operate under tight cognitive constraints, where uncertainty is removed and processing can accelerate safely. When those constraints are finally imposed, the jump in speed feels extreme simply because the baseline was artificially slow. Understanding this context matters, because nothing about fast study is unnatural. What's unnatural is how most people have been trained to learn. Once that conditioning is exposed, the idea of illegal speed starts to dissolve, and what remains is a method your brain was always capable of using. The core rule behind studying so fast it feels illegal is this: the brain accelerates when it is forced to decide what does not matter, because speed is not created by adding effort, but by removing ambiguity. The moment the brain knows exactly what is essential, what is secondary, and what can be ignored, processing time collapses dramatically. Most people study by expanding the problem, collecting more explanations, more examples, more sources, hoping clarity will emerge from volume. What actually happens is the opposite. The brain slows down to manage excess input, juggling possibilities, holding context, and constantly reassessing relevance. Speed dies in indecision, not in difficulty. High-speed learners invert this process. They compress first and expand only if necessary. Before consuming information, they impose a strict cognitive filter that limits scope, defines the outcome, and forces prioritization. This filter tells the brain, only this matters right now, which immediately reduces cognitive load and frees processing capacity. When that compression is in place, learning feels unnatural at first, because understanding arrives faster than expected. Connections form without struggle, and recall becomes easier than repetition-based study ever allowed. This is where the sensation of illegal speed comes from, not from skipping work, but from skipping noise. Once you understand this rule, studying fast stops being mysterious. It becomes a mechanical consequence of clarity. The brain is no longer trying to understand everything, only what it was explicitly instructed to understand, and that single shift is enough to double or triple learning speed without increasing time, stress, or effort. Compression is the moment where learning stops being exploratory and becomes operational, because instead of asking the brain to understand everything, you force it to extract the smallest structure that still works, and that single demand changes how information is processed at a neurological level. When you compress a topic, you are not simplifying it in a superficial way, but collapsing it into a functional core, identifying the few principles that generate the rest, which dramatically reduces the number of variables the brain needs to track at once. This reduction alone frees working memory and allows attention to move faster, with less friction and hesitation. In most study methods, compression happens accidentally, after hours of exposure, repetition, and mental fatigue. In high-speed learning, compression happens first, before deep study begins, which flips the entire process. The brain is no longer searching blindly for meaning, it is validating and refining a structure that already exists. This is why compressed learning feels strange at first. You feel like you're moving too fast, like you didn't earn the understanding yet, but what's actually happening is that your brain is operating with fewer degrees of freedom, which is exactly how speed is created in any complex system. Less choice, less noise, more execution. Once this pattern is repeated, the brain begins to expect compression as the entry point to learning. It stops resisting new material and starts asking a different question automatically. What is the core here? And that shift alone can cut learning time in half, not by skipping work, but by eliminating everything that never needed to be processed in the first place. Most people sabotage compression long before they ever give it a chance to work, because they confuse learning with accumulation and feel unsafe reducing information too early, as if cutting material means risking misunderstanding, when in reality the opposite is happening at a cognitive level. One of the most common sabotage patterns is premature expansion, diving into details, examples, and edge cases before a core structure exists. This overwhelms working memory and forces the brain to slow down, because it has no hierarchy to organize what it's receiving. Instead of learning faster, the brain becomes defensive, trying to hold everything at once. Another hidden sabotage is emotional reassurance. Many people keep consuming content not because they need it, but because it feels safer to keep reading than to stop and commit to a compressed understanding. Compression feels risky because it demands a decision, this is what matters, and the brain is uncomfortable with that responsibility if it has been trained to equate certainty with volume. There is also the habit of outsourcing structure to the source, relying on books, videos, or teachers to do the organizing instead of forcing the brain to build its own framework early. This keeps learning passive and slow, because speed only emerges when the brain actively imposes order, not when it waits for clarity to be delivered. Until these habits are exposed, compression feels fragile and unstable. Once they are removed, compression becomes the fastest path to clarity, because the brain finally stops drowning in information and starts operating on structure. There is a precise moment where the sensation of illegal speed disappears, not because you slow down, but because the brain finally understands what is happening. What once felt reckless starts to feel deliberate, repeatable, and strangely calm, because speed is no longer emerging from excitement or novelty, but from control. At this point, studying stops triggering emotional responses. There is no anxiety about missing something, no urge to overconsume information, and no internal negotiation about whether you are doing enough. The brain recognizes the compressed structure, locks onto it, and executes cleanly. Speed becomes a side effect of certainty, not a gamble. This is where most people misunderstand high-speed learning. They think the goal is to always feel fast, when in reality the goal is to feel stable while moving fast. In operational environments, speed without control is useless. What matters is the ability to enter the same cognitive state repeatedly, under different conditions, without friction or hesitation. Once compression is trusted, the brain stops resisting expansion. Details, examples, and nuances can be added later without slowing the system down, because they are attaching to a stable core instead of competing for attention. Learning becomes modular, clean, and scalable. From here on, studying no longer feels like cheating the process. It feels like using it correctly. Speed stops being something that surprises you and becomes something you can summon intentionally, simply by recreating the conditions that force clarity and eliminate noise. One of the fastest ways to destroy high-speed study is turning compression into arrogance, assuming that because learning feels fast, verification is no longer necessary. Speed without validation creates fragile understanding, and the brain quickly learns that this mode is unreliable, which reintroduces hesitation and slows everything down again. Another common trap is mistaking novelty for efficiency. Jumping between methods, frameworks, and sources creates the illusion of optimization, but it prevents the nervous system from stabilizing a single cognitive pattern long enough for speed to become automatic. High-speed learning depends on repetition of conditions, not constant reinvention. There is also the myth that fast study means shallow understanding. In reality, shallow learning comes from passive consumption, not speed. When compression is done correctly, Depth is added after structure is secured, which allows complexity to be integrated without overwhelming the system. Slowing down prematurely in the name of depth often reintroduces noise and cognitive drag. Another invisible trap is emotional attachment to struggle. Some people subconsciously distrust learning that doesn't hurt, so they sabotage speed by adding unnecessary difficulty, extra material, or longer sessions, just to feel like the effort is legitimate. This retrains the brain to associate learning with friction, undoing the very conditions that enabled speed. Avoiding these traps is not about discipline, but about respecting the mechanics of cognitive efficiency. When compression, validation, and repetition are balanced correctly, speed remains stable, reliable, and controllable, instead of collapsing under its own weight. When learning speed reaches a level that feels almost illegal, the brain is not breaking any rules, it is simply operating closer to its optimal efficiency range, something that has been consistently observed in research on cognitive load, expert performance, and accelerated skill acquisition. What changes is not intelligence, but how neural resources are allocated. Studies on cognitive load theory show that when irrelevant information is removed and structure is imposed early, working memory can process and integrate new material significantly faster, because it is no longer overwhelmed by competing inputs. Compression reduces extraneous load, which allows the brain to recognize patterns earlier and with less effort. Research on expert learning also reveals that high performers across domains spend less time processing raw information and more time interacting with structured representations, mental models, frameworks, and principles. This is why experts appear to learn faster than novices, not because they absorb more data, but because their brains immediately map new information onto existing compressed structures. Neuroscience studies on focused attention indicate that when tasks are clearly bounded and goals are explicit, neural activity becomes more synchronized, reducing internal interference and increasing processing speed. The brain stops monitoring for alternatives and commits fully to execution, which subjectively feels like mental sharpness and rapid comprehension. When these conditions are combined and repeated, the nervous system learns that fast learning is safe, controlled, and reliable. Speed stops triggering stress responses and becomes the default mode. What feels illegal at first is simply the absence of friction most people have been conditioned to accept as normal. At this level, speed is not created by talent or intensity, but by running a tight cognitive system that forces the brain to behave efficiently whether it feels ready or not. The system is simple, but unforgiving, because it removes the behaviors that allow learning to slow down without you noticing. The first component is pre-commitment to compression. Before touching any material, you define a single question the session must answer, not a topic to explore, but a result to produce. This forces the brain to scan for structure immediately instead of drifting into accumulation mode. Without this step, speed collapses before the session even begins. The second component is time containment with pressure. Sessions are short, fixed, and non-negotiable, long enough to demand focus, but short enough to prevent emotional pacing. This tells the nervous system that there is no advantage in delaying clarity, so it accelerates processing instead of conserving energy. The third component is forced reconstruction. You never end a session by rereading or reviewing. You end by rebuilding the core idea from memory, explaining it, sketching it, or applying it without looking. This step exposes weak compression instantly and trains the brain to value clarity over coverage. When this system is repeated daily, the brain adapts quickly. Entry friction disappears, learning speed stabilizes, and what once felt illegal becomes predictable. The system doesn't rely on motivation, mood, or inspiration. It works because it removes the conditions that allow slowness to survive. At the end of this process, what changes is not just how fast you study, but how your brain relates to knowledge itself. Learning stops being something you endure and becomes something you execute with precision, because the system removes uncertainty, emotional drag, and unnecessary effort from the equation. Speed becomes calm, controlled, and repeatable. When compression, time pressure, and forced reconstruction are applied consistently, the brain learns a powerful pattern. Clarity arrives quickly when noise is eliminated. Over time, this rewires your default approach to any subject. Instead of asking how long something will take, your mind immediately looks for structure, boundaries, and leverage. That alone creates a massive advantage. What feels illegal at first is simply the absence of friction most people accept as normal. While others are drowning in information, second-guessing their methods, and pacing themselves emotionally, you are operating inside a system that forces decisive learning. The gap that opens up is not subtle, and it compounds fast. Eventually, speed stops feeling like a trick and starts feeling like identity. You trust your process, you trust your compression, and you trust your ability to enter that cognitive state on demand. That trust is what turns fast learning into a long-term edge instead of a temporary burst of productivity. If you want to keep developing this level of cognitive control and build a mind that learns decisively under pressure, subscribe to the channel and support the project. Learning faster isn't about doing more, it's about knowing exactly how to move when it's time to think.